Hello everyone, and welcome to this lesson on medieval warfare. I'm covering this subject because it's important to understand all aspects of what it was like to live in the medieval era. And warfare played a daily role in life. You may remember, and I believe that we talked about it in one previous class, I stated that there had been warfare to the point that the church was required to issue a document called the Peace of God, which meant that you could not fight on certain days of the week. And this was meant to reduce the near daily fights between nobles and other, various branches of the nobility, even under the same king, would fight against each other. And sometimes king would fight against king, and they almost didn't care what day it was. And the church said, we need to have a break. Even during the week, we need to have a break. And so it was a constant and very present part of their life. And it has a lot of different aspects to it. So what I'm covering here is just a very narrow frame of it, but I wanted to give you some taste and reference for and of medieval warfare. And our specific example will be the Battle of Agincourt. First thing I'd like you to do is throw out any ideas that it was like Game of Thrones. I don't know if you have seen Game of Thrones as a full series, or maybe you've watched clips on youtube.com. Just allow me to say Game of Thrones was a medieval fantasy world. So it had elements of medievalism in it, but it does not have a one-for-one correspondence with any reality that we are aware of. Now, as I said before, warfare differed slightly in each region, but there were some commonalities and common elements. So some of these things can be applied very, as we say, universally. And just understand, one of the things that I will be hitting on frequently in this brief video is medieval warfare was difficult, slow, hot, sweaty. It was brutal and often very cruel. This is not romantic warfare. It's not the one-on-one sword fighting duels that you often see in movies. No, this was very hot, grungy, dirty, clanking, clattering clash of metal and arms. And basically it was just kind of imagine this huge protest fight, this mass of people pushing and shoving against each other. It was really a return to the type of Greek warfare that had been in previous generations. This is the battlefield disposition of Agincourt, and I want to bring out several things. It's not easy to see on this map, but this was the best. Right here, where I'm circling, is the archers. These are the archers. And these are more archers here, English archers. And in the middle were the knights, the nobles. Over here, this is a thickly wooded area. Over here, this is also a thickly wooded area. There's actually a village here and a village here, and then a third one there. This is open field, open ground. So the two woods had a very significant geographic impact on the Battle of Agincourt because it made the battlefield very narrow. And they camped overnight within sight of each other. They just kind of woke up the next morning and agreed now was their time to fight. Fighting had a very different type of feel at that time, and the one thing that is surprising is how set and orderly it would be, at least at the first. You would almost fight by agreement. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready to fight. Okay, we are too. Let's get ready. So, and it was fought in October. And so the night before and the day before, it had rained pretty heavily. So the ground was very wet and soggy. And some of the knights reported actually sinking down a little bit into the mud because of their heavy armor and just the weight and softness, the weight of their armor, the softness of the ground caused them to have difficulty moving. Now it would be the French who attacked the English position. The English position is here. The French position was here, and they moved towards the English who had set themselves up. So as I said, in the battle and often during other battles, the armies gathered within sight of each other and would camp in such ways you could see your enemy's campfires and maybe sometimes even movement around them. Now, the knights wore heavy armor that made movement very difficult. We're talking about kilos, 20, 40, 50 kilos of weight. I'm making some slight guesses here, but some of the weight could average out to 126 pounds of armor. That basically would be like attaching another me. If I were going into this battle, it'd be like if somebody just kind of threw another me on my back, or it was bear hugging. So it'd be very difficult. And you're not running at these great speeds. You're just kind of slowly moving along, kind of like I do when I'm at school and going up the stairs, you know. The knights assembled in a group in the middle, as I showed, and with the archers on the left and the right wings. And this provided not only cover, but also allowed the arrows to come in from an angle and made it more difficult to get around their shots. And the point of the arrows, you would think, well, why would they shoot arrows at men in armor? Well, the arrows would find spots and spaces between the armor, and that's where they would penetrate. If you could penetrate the eye holes of the helmet, then obviously you've wounded somebody and taken them out with an eye shot. But sometimes hands, feet, other areas might be vulnerable to attack if they weren't properly covered in armor, or if there was a significant gap between. And like I said, the knights charged in a group, but very slowly. And even the mounted knights, they would just imagine you've got basically two people, the weight of two people on one horse, and that horse has to ride into battle. And so they would often go in a charging manner, but not very fast, maybe only about 10 miles per hour or less. So as I said, medieval battles were slow. They were not quick. They were not the type of 30, 45-minute affairs that most ancient battles were. They might be an hour or two, and that's just simply because of how long it's taking everybody to move and get into their various positions. Now, as I said, the knight was very heavy in his horse, and so the aim was to knock the knight out of his seat onto the ground. And so, basically you would take the lance and you'd knock him down onto the ground. You couldn't generally kill somebody with a lance unless you, again, hit him in a very specific and very particular place, maybe found the vulnerable spot between the armor plating. But mostly what you were doing was knocking people down to the ground. That is significant because knights died on the ground. Some of them fell face down into the mud and the dirt and died of suffocation because they couldn't breathe. They could not roll over and catch air. Some of them laid on the ground throughout the battle and were stepped on, pushed, shoved, knocked around. Basically, you're watching as people spit and fight and sweat and bleed over you, and you're just kind of there laying down. Now at the end of the battle, they would go around and the victor would look for knights of wealth, wealthy knights. They would ask you, are you wealthy? Can you ransom yourself? Can you basically send for money to pay them to release you? If you were poor, if you had no family to ransom you or to pay for your liberty, they would give you what is called the coup de grace. And that is where they take a knife with a long blade and shove it through your eye into your brain. Or they might pull off a part of your helmet and slit your throat, or turn you over and hit you with that same knife behind the ear and into the brain. So the coup de grace was given quite a bit. If you were a rich knight, then you would be ransomed. Again, ransoming is paying money for your life. And this might result in you being a prisoner of war for a year or two. It just kind of depended on how long it took your message to reach your family in England or from wherever you were from, and whether they had the money to pay for you, whether they had the willingness to pay for you, or if they sent a letter back and said, no, we're not going to pay the money, you were destined to die. The king would often fight in the battle, and he was not one to just merely watch. That would have been considered cowardly and inexcusable. Kings had traditionally led armies into battle and had fought alongside their men, and this was, something that happened. And it encouraged and inspired leadership and following, and it gave purpose to the men. They felt like their king or their leader shared in their struggles and their conflicts, and it gave a renewed sense of devotion, really, in a lot of ways. We live in a very different age and era when presidents or dictators or men in leadership just simply sit behind a desk in a three-piece suit and order men into war when they don't generally face that same conflict. And so it's definitely a different way of fighting. Now, sieges of cities were common, and sometimes it was more common to engage in a siege, and it was actually better to engage in a siege than an open field battle. Open field battles had a lot of risk. Of course, the king was not always happy to go into battle. He knew he might have to, but he wasn't necessarily eager for that. Some sieges could last up to a year or longer. Henry led one siege that killed 12,000 men, women, and children. When did that take place? Well, it took place at the city of Rouen, which was, as I said, laid siege to by Henry V. Starvation was taking hold inside of the city, so 12,000 men, women, and children deemed to be the weakest and most in need were put outside the city walls. And the hope was that the king would take compassion on these people and they could go and find food. So you have a city that is running low on food, and you need to create a bigger food supply by reducing the people in the city. So you don't want to do anything against them, but you will put them out. Now, instead of giving compassion to them, Henry placed these 12,000 people in a ditch and kept soldiers at the edge of the ditch to prevent them escaping. So these 12,000 people died slowly over a period of months. To quote one of the chroniclers, said, "One might see wandering here and there children of 2 and 3 years old begging for bread since their parents were dead. Babies were christened and then sent back into the ditch to die." Henry didn't have any extra resources, and he didn't want to face these people out in the open. And, I am not going to make a moral judgment regarding whether he did a right thing or a wrong thing. It was a very common way of dealing with sieges. There were other times when people escaped the city, and instead of being, so there are a couple of outcomes. You escape the city, and you might be allowed through the lines. More generally, you might be kept from re-entering the city, and you're in the no man's land between the attacking army and the city or the place under siege. The other outcome is that you might be forced back into the city that either threw you out or you were ejected from in that case. So one or two outcomes, neither very pretty. Thank you for your attention. Please put your full name on the video. Do your homework, which is the ambassador report from the other country. So you're posted in a place like Paris, France, or somewhere like that, and you're writing back to Mongolia about your experiences there.